We ended the last video with the observation that your view of the world will show up again in your view of the inner life, in the questions you ask, in your scholarship. Now, let's consider this passage from a recent book. It's 4 pages in the book, 2 pages typed out. It focuses on Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic. And this text, I'd say, takes a critical approach. And that's not an indictment. It's an attempt for me to understand what I read. I enjoyed it, but I also felt like something was missing here. And that, of course, is going to happen. Happens whenever authors choose to focus on certain themes and to leave others out. So let's compare this text to a couple other books that I found around my house. The treatments are all roughly the same length. The texts are linked. One treats Hildegard as an example to follow. Others salute her accomplishments. This one, however, starts off that we know so very little of Hildegard's early life, save that in 1106 she was apparently immured, literally walled into a cell with a local hermit named Jutta, when Hildegard was just 8. By the time she formally became a nun in 1113, this hermitage had effectively become part of a double monastery. When Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard became leader of the female religious there. No mention here of her noble parents, her 9 older siblings, the fact that she was sick throughout her life, or the very early age at which her visions started. One text described her as, quote, dedicated to God since birth. Another observes how she lived all but 8 of her 82 years as a Benedictine, but started off as an unexceptional nun before growing famous in that role. Instead of saying that she was trapped or walled in there, you could say that this was the perfect place for a young mystic. It provided her with a mentor, with education, and with leadership opportunities. Or you could focus on the conflict, focusing on a quirk in the Latin where she was literally walled in. Then, in 1150, she moved her nuns to a new foundation and separated them from the monastery. There she remained until her death in 1179. Now, why did she move? Other sources tell us how the popular convent had outgrown the monastery, which, along with the local town, objected to that move because they feared losing income from all the pilgrims. That's one version of the story in economic analysis. Monasteries and convents were big business, and that helps us understand why. She quarreled with the local archbishops, and her community was excommunicated from 1178 to 1179, although she generally maintained exceptional relationships with Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the papacy, and many of the most powerful men and women of Europe throughout her life. And during all that time, she wrote. Okay, let's get to it. What did she write? What does Hildegard have to say to us? Well, don't ask these guys. They don't seem too interested. That's not their project. The direct quotes are highlighted here, and as you can see, some texts have more, some have fewer. Back to it. Having claimed she experienced visions from God since the age of 5, the other sources say since the age of 3, these moments of supposed revelation became the basis of most of her works, particularly her longest and best known Scivias, written between 1141 and 1151. This work, particularly the claim of visions, attracted the attention of the papacy, and a commission was sent to investigate. Now, the authors sound pretty skeptical about these visions, but they also criticize others for sharing that skepticism. That girl must have been crazy, and those guys were jerks for not believing her. But my issue is not just with the critical approach's lack of coherence. I accuse it of missing something, of missing her. She's the type of historic figure who grows more and more interesting the more you know about her. That's my impression, and this woman gave it to me. So if you want to know more about Hildegard of Bingen, check out the video. It's linked up. Check it out, and check out these pictures illustrated by the saint herself. But they're not mentioned in the text. Neither does this text mention how Hildegard saw humanity as the universe and microcosm, as sparks struggling to rejoin the symphony of joy emanating from the living light. How she employed a remarkable word, greenness, or verditas, to describe the animating energy that shines forth in all living persons. how for this holistic vision, Hildegard has been particularly celebrated by proponents of environmental spirituality. Instead, the critical text says, the claim of visions attracted the attention of the papacy and a commission was sent to investigate. The men were satisfied with what they found, with the Pope commanding her to write any further visions down, and she did. Again, they assume conflict here. These pages come from a chapter in that book about gender roles in the Middle Ages, so nothing wrong with writing about that. Tell that story. But don't forget to tell Hildegard's story, or if you're going to mention her, you might as well tell us something important about her, something interesting about her. She's an interesting person. But really, what the critical authors do, they give themselves an impossible task. They're attempting to show how the women in this century were ignored, so they chose an example. The only problem is this woman is known 8.5 centuries later precisely because she was not ignored. The authors have their own goal in mind, and to accomplish it, they end up turning Hildegard from the hero to the victim of her own story. They describe her not as her contemporaries saw her, someone called out for unique blessings, or at the very least a remarkable genius. Instead, they describe her as someone small, someone who makes a claim, attracts an investigation, and is commanded to write for the benefit of others. Here's another telling of that same story, quote, her visions pressed upon her with greater urgency until she eventually described them to her confessor. She was bidden to write them down. The archbishop assembled a team of theologians. They certified their orthodoxy, and henceforth Hildegard was provided with a monk as secretary. You saw him in one of those pictures. See, opportunity here knocked in that telling of the story, and she was there to take advantage of it. And here's yet another version of the story. It always happens in the life of true mystics. Hildegard, too, wanted to put herself under the authority of wise people like the famous Bernard of Clairvaux, who calmed and encouraged her, people who would help her discern the origin of her visions. And this is the seal, according to the author here, this is the seal of an authentic experience, complete obedience to the ecclesiastical authority, which, through her pastors, recognizes the authenticity. Now, there's a positive view of church authority from, not surprisingly, a leader of the hierarchy. So yes, there is a conflict of interest here. Every author has skin in the game, has a position. Context matters. No one's denying that. And this is the critical approach's self-proclaimed superpower, the ability to take an honest look, the complete story, putting everything in the necessary context. Again, no one denies that context matters. To prove it, one source points out that Hildegard was, quote, expressing herself in the cultural and religious categories of her time. Another admits that in recent decades she has emerged into the light, partly thanks to contemporary interest in the role of women in history. So no one denies the context, but context is supposed to provide more detail, not less. It should be the stage on which an individual's unique contributions are highlighted, not where they are hid. Here, the men were satisfied with what they found, with the Pope commanding her to write any more visions that she had, and she did. Her surviving correspondence. Now, what about the visions? Tell us something about the visions. We were talking about visions, but now there's a jump to something totally different. And okay, fine. If you're not going to describe the visions, let's hear about her correspondence. Her surviving correspondence is one of the greatest troves of extant medieval sources, with letters to and from kings, emperors, popes, and the greatest luminaries of 12th century Europe. In addition, she composed treatises on, among other things, music. Now, is that somebody you want to learn more about? Someone who, quote, composed treatises on, among other things, music. How about a composer of music of haunting beauty and originality? She composed hymns, antiphons, and songs that were performed joyously in her monasteries, spreading an atmosphere of tranquility, and that have come down to us. For her, the entire creation is a symphony of joy and jubilation. Or she composed treatises on, among other things, music, science and medicine, hagiography, the study of saints, the monastic life, and perhaps most important, theology. It is an impressive list, an impressive resume, but still, in this text, she is a mere composer of treatises, not an exciting description of a person. not calling her an unusual mixture of administrator and visionary, pietist and radical, poet and scientist, physician and saint. Not someone who manifests the versatility, the cultural vivacity of the female monasteries of the Middle Ages. Not an author and theologian, prophet and preacher, musician and composer, poet and artist, doctor and pharmacist, whose book on clinical medicine was rich in medical lore, even if it was marred here and there with magic formulas. I mean, that sounds interesting. That's somebody I'd like to meet or learn about. Someone ahead of her time who seems to have anticipated the principles of homeopathy, a visionary whose ecological and holistic spirituality speaks prophetically to our time. She sounds like a revolutionary, not somebody who composed treatises on, among other things, science. And wait a second. Why would you say theology was the most important? Because it was connected directly to the reform and direction of the church, and because that was dangerous territory for women. Oh, I get it. This was most important for the critical authors, not necessarily for Hildegard. Remember that eclectic list is how modern people might describe her work. There's no evidence that Hildegard herself would recognize strict boundaries between those different categories. But here, professed women religious were certainly nothing new to Christianity in the 12th century, but the vast majority of holy women had achieved considerations of sanctity. Now, who talks or writes like that? Congratulations, you've achieved considerations of sanctity. You're talking about people who were venerated, even worshipped, celebrated at least, achieved considerations of sanctity via their actions, oftentimes their martyrdom, not through their writing. And her writing, you said, was dangerous. Okay, what did she write? You still haven't told us. The ability to interpret the divine plan was an activity generally reserved for men, and biblical commentary in the period was tremendously popular, with learned Christians, again mostly men, turning to the sacred page to better understand not only the sacred past, but the sacred present and future as well. Hildegard's ability to insert herself into that conversation via her visions was extraordinary, dodging patriarchal restrictions on female authority by first receiving authorization directly from the divine and then from the church hierarchy, by the papacy in 1147 and 48, and then even, albeit faintly, by the famous Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux. It was perhaps no wonder that emperors, kings, and popes sought her counsel. Now, you're saying they sought her counsel because of Hildegard's ability to insert herself into a popular but male-dominated conversation via claiming visions as a dodge to patriarchal restrictions. They sought her input because she was a savvy politician. Now, that's cynical, but it's just also plainly wrong. Rulers wanted to talk to her and wanted to write to her because she was specifically not seen as political. She was a mystic. Her letter to Henry II, for example, is more than a simple admonition of spiritual comfort. It is an exhortation on how to govern his kingdom. Gee, it sure would be nice if you told us or you quoted that letter, but you don't. See, she was telling him how best to be a king, and Henry was not alone, as she sent similar messages to the emperors Conrad III and Frederick Barbarossa. Interesting. Again, what did she say? And this type of advice is an old genre dating back to the time of Charlemagne at least, but Hildegard is flipping things on their head, inserting herself as a woman into conversations with measured words. Hildegard, throughout her writings, portrays herself as humble and relatively uneducated. She says in her letter to Bernard, wait a minute, that's another bait and switch. Bernard was a church leader. We're talking about kings and emperors here. And since the critical text never gives us an example, we will turn to another text to read about what she wrote to Frederick Barbarossa. The prophetess, presuming to speak for God, says, you will be sorry for the wicked conduct of the godless who despise me. Listen, O king, if you wish to live. Otherwise, my sword will pierce you. That's what I'd call corresponding in a tone of inspired authority and in prose of masculine power. It's not what I'd describe, quote, measured words or a humble portrayal. Next, though, a quote at last. She says in her letter to Bernard, I have an inward understanding of the Psalter, the Gospels, and other volumes. Nevertheless, I do not receive this knowledge in German. Indeed, I have no formal training at all, for I know how to read Latin only on the most elementary level, certainly with no deep analysis. I am untaught and untrained in exterior material, but I am only taught inwardly in my spirit. And yet her letters and visions brim with allusions to ancient Greek and Latin authors, as well as biblical citations that engage directly with a long tradition of monastic biblical commentary going back to the Church Fathers. As such, we have to conclude that her humility was a pose, albeit not a cynical one. And that's right, the only quote is disingenuous. It's a pose, an abjection she performed. And the same quote, strangely, the same quote, a slightly different translation of it, occurs in the other sources, and there the emphasis is not on her lack of formal training, but on the depth of her infused insight, how it, quote, fascinates her whole being, burns in her chest, and teaches her the most profound understanding. But in order to make it fit their preconceived project, the critical authors again turn something nearly into its complete opposite. It's a pose, not a cynical one, but a pose. Men in this period used it all the time as well. Hildegard was a woman in a patriarchal society, and we cannot erase that patriarchy even as we recognize her agency. True enough, but where in this text is she seen exercising agency? Where is she seen challenging us to change our mind about something in this text? What this means is that given the context in which she lived, whereas someone like Thomas Aquinas could derive authority from their training, Hildegard's could not come from her education, her training in how to read the Bible within Christian tradition. That abjection she performed for Bernard had to be repeated. Authority was akin to a two-factor verification. It had to come from her connection as a prophet, and even then had to subsequently receive papal approval to continue. And there is something to this. Hildegard and Aquinas had different roles, different constraints, different spheres of influences within which to work. They had different tightropes to walk, you could say. Both found themselves in and out of trouble from time to time. And yeah, gender is part of that story. No one's denying that gender is part of that story. The authors here fail, though, when, at least in this part of the chapter, they make it the entire story, the only story. What about Hildegard's story? A woman's authority always rested on a knife's edge. Even at the height of her fame and authority, Hildegard was suspect. The prophetess who enjoyed the blessings of kings, emperors, and popes was still excommunicated by the Archbishop of Mainz in 1178. She had allowed an excommunicated man to be buried on the hallowed ground in her community, saying that he had been reconciled to the church before his death. The Archbishop disagreed, and the excommunication was decreed, and other sources describe this as a, quote, terrible sanction to which she protested bitterly, one that was eventually lifted, but she only had a few months longer to live. In the critical text, however, Hildegard is not even allowed to be angry at the injustice committed against her. She's resigned. She has to be resigned to this in the text. And Hildegard first invoked her prophetic authority, that she knew she was in the right, but that failed. This was a dispute about authority and hierarchy, and one that she was always going to lose. Again, the authors are ignoring the economics of the situation. Formal juridical excommunications were rare back then, rare today too. They were reserved for troublemakers who threatened the church's authority, and one of the downsides of being excommunicated is that you could not be buried in Christian consecrated ground. Whatever we think about that today, it was a strong motivating factor for some people back in the Middle Ages. Contrition expressed before a holy abbess was one thing, but the bishop still had a real economic interest in requiring a public recantation before allowing somebody to be buried in hallowed ground. The excommunication was eventually lifted, but only after she humbly submitted to the archbishop's authority. Hildegard may have possessed power and prestige, but in the 12th century, even a prophetess had to know her place. And that's their conclusion. That's what the authors here want us to come away from the story thinking. And the problem is not that it's untrue, but that it's trite. It's boring. Everyone has limits in their station in life. Everyone, quote, needs to know their place, you could say. The authors don't tell us about what she did or the obstacles she overcame. They prefer to focus on obstacles that she didn't overcome because they could not, ever be overcome by anyone. And that's just an injustice to her genius. And since they say that she should know her place, we could mention here that in 2012, she was placed on a list as the 35th Doctor of the Church.